after the Civil War, or the war between the states, whichever you prefer to call it, there was no iron curtain between the North and the South, but there was a line there nevertheless, an imaginary sectional line that was as effective in the hearts of the people, especially in Georgia, as any iron curtain could ever have been. And for a long time, it seemed that Uncle Sam's children would never work and play together as brothers again. But something happened to change all of that.
The years just after the Civil War were a time of rebuilding across much of America. But while veterans were anxious to get back to the business of everyday life, many of them were having a difficult time, especially Midwestern farmers. Low crop prices, large debts, and heavy mortgages were taking their toll on the farms of the heartland. By the 1890s, natural disasters were adding more problems. Severe droughts destroyed the crops, blizzards froze the land. Civil War veterans were facing new battles that could not be won by foot soldiers or generals. In Indiana, a former Union Army drummer boy was increasingly aware of their plight. In the decades following the war, Philander H. Fitzgerald had become a pension attorney for Union veterans and the editor of the American Tribune, a weekly national newspaper based in Indianapolis. In an editorial, Mr. Fitzgerald suggested that a colony be established for aging Union veterans to live out their lives.
Mr. Fitzgerald thought that someone would establish a colony somewhere in the Southland and bring all of those Union veterans down here. It would get them away from the bitter winters and away from the drought-stricken area, because the men were desperate where they were, and they knew they could not stay there another winter.
Mr. Fitzgerald wrote letters to several Southern governors, telling them about the proposed colony. Georgia Governor William J. Northern was intrigued with the idea and pledged his support. He invited Mr. Fitzgerald to travel the state with him. In the 1890s, South Georgia still consisted mainly of scattered black and white rural farming communities amid piney woods and cypress swamps. But since the end of the Civil War, thousands of African Americans had migrated south from the Carolinas to work in turpentine camps, deep in Georgia's wiregrass region. The tiny village of Swan, population 40, was home to one such lumber and turpentine business. The Drew brothers, early white settlers in the area, had purchased thousands of acres of virgin pine forest in the 1880s, just 9 miles from the spot where Jefferson Davis was captured. Mr. Fitzgerald and Governor Northern decided that the area around Swan was the perfect place to establish the soldiers' colony. An early report about the site by a committee established by Mr. Fitzgerald noted that the hospitality of the people is all that could be desired, and all colony people of the North will receive a warm and hearty welcome by the natives. The report added that not one of us as yet has had the pleasure of seeing an alligator. In order to raise money to purchase the land, Mr. Fitzgerald established a nonprofit corporation, the American Tribune Soldiers Colony Company. He publicized the effort in his newspaper and advertised stock at $10 a share. The money began to pour in from veterans who saw new hope for their future. In July 1895, the Drew brothers sold 50,000 acres of their land to the Colony Company. This would form the nucleus of the new colony, which would eventually double in size to 100,000 acres. Now the real work of establishing a town began. 462 men and 72 teams of horses began to clear the land. Surveyors were busy laying out the new town into 4 wards, with schools, businesses, parks, and residential areas clearly designated. But although the dream was becoming a reality, it was clear that some of the nation's bitter wounds had not yet healed.
Mr. Fitzgerald wanted a 4-square city, and he wanted it to be in the heart of the 100,000 acres that they were seeking. It took them a while because they had to move that center stake 3 times. The surveyors had to move it 3 times because some Southern over here or over there would refuse to sell 1 inch of land to the Yankees.
While the surveyors were still at work, veterans and their families began arriving. By the fall of 1895, 2,500 people had flocked to the new colony. Many were anxious to leave their Midwestern farms and come to a southern wilderness rather than struggle through another bitter winter. One observer, Mrs. George Morris, described the pilgrimage as a steady stream of wagons and carts almost any time of day, piled high with furniture and people, even cats, dogs, and chickens, and now and then a cow tied on behind. Henry Mills, who traveled to the colony with his family, wrote in his diary that at many places in Kentucky, Tennessee, and Georgia, we had no roads at all to follow.
The people were desperate where they were and started to come in before Mr. Fitzgerald was ready for them. They had to go somewhere. Can you imagine thousands of people moving into the heart of a pine forest and setting up housekeeping?
Those who did come were forced to live in tents or covered wagons. They camped out in the pine woods or built crude shelters. The village was dubbed Shacktown because of all the temporary shacks being constructed. The Daily Gazette, a South Georgia newspaper, wrote that Shacktown lined both sides of the wagon road. To drive along this road brought more sights than the midway of a carnival. Everyone was busy. Soft drink stands were numerous, and about every fourth or fifth house was an eating house. People were living in all manner of habitation except good ones.
One lady, a teacher from Nebraska, decided she'd solve the housing problem until they could finish the surveys, and she asked permission of Mr. Fitzgerald to build a temporary hotel. She built what they called the Colony House. It became famous as the Colony House. And as high, it was a two-story building. They didn't even have glass windows, just had wooden shutters. As high as 36 men would sleep in one room.
At last, the survey of the town was nearing completion. Construction of the downtown commercial district began. The town plan was based on the typical Midwestern grid layout. Even the look of the early buildings was reminiscent of Midwestern styles. But while the influence of Northern architecture and town planning was obvious in the emerging town, the Colony Company was careful not to alienate any veteran moving to the town, Union or Confederate.
As the surveys were completed, they started the naming of the streets. And the first thing they did was to name a number of the streets for Union generals. But then they had a second thought because they thought, well, we must name an equal number for Confederate generals. We're in the South now. So the Union streets start with Grant and Sherman. The Confederate side with Lee and Johnston. The rest of the streets were named for Georgia rivers and Georgia trees.
As fall turned into winter, the veterans continued coming to the new settlement. Newspaper ads promoting the colony were widely read in New York, Chicago, Baltimore, and Washington. By December 1895, 6 months after the initial land purchase, over 5,000 people had settled in the new colony. Most of the colonists were Union veterans, but about 1/3 of them were Southerners. Even though the war still held painful memories, they were intent on building a new town alongside their former enemies. One of the biggest problems was the lack of supplies. Even though they were situated in the middle of a pine forest and the sawmills buzzed day and night to meet the demand for lumber, the colonists still needed everything else to live. One settler, Mrs. August Demmel, later recalled that it was the rainy season and we lived in a tent until we could build our house. I walked 2 miles for milk for my children.
So they decided to stop building the city and build the railroad line on into the colony. And you'll never guess what the railroad officials did when they got the railroad finished. They scheduled excursion trains in here and advertised it widely for people to come and get a look at the Yankees.
The idea of thousands of former Yankees living deep in enemy territory sparked the interest of many tourists. The Colony Company was eager to attract these visitors, as well as to provide work for the colonists. Construction of the massive Lee Grant Hotel began in 1896, tactfully giving top billing to the man who had been the commander of the Confederate forces. In addition to visitors, new residents continued to find their way to the colony. The town now boasted businesses with names that reveal the settlers' origins: the Michigan Restaurant, the Ohio Clothing House, the New York Bargain Store, and the Hotel Nebraska.
So many people were coming to the colony every day. There was a stream of wagons going up the road to the colony headquarters. The secretary of the colony company, Curtis Wise, decided he'd call the roll by states and see how many states were represented. He called the roll at the exact center of the town. He had an answer from Maine to California and from Washington to Florida.
By the fall of 1896, the colony's first schools were calling their rolls. They counted 501 students from 38 states and 2 territories. The town, now called Fitzgerald after its founder, was still growing. The combined pensions of the colony's Union veterans, over $50,000 a month, helped ensure its success. But the determination of the early settlers was also a key factor. While other areas of the country were struggling with a devastating economic depression, Fitzgerald citizens looked back on a prosperous year, with plenty to show for their hard work. The colonists decided to celebrate their good fortune with a harvest festival. They constructed a large building, the Corn and Cotton Palace, to display their wares. Invitations were sent to people in nearby towns. The citizens also planned 2 parades, one for Union veterans and one for Confederate veterans from the surrounding area. On the day of the festival, the crowd gathered and the band assembled inside the Corn and Cotton Palace. The Confederates were scheduled to parade first, wearing their gray uniforms. After a short break, the Union veterans would march in a line of blue. The organizing committee hoped there would be no trouble, but they knew that feelings about the war were still strong.
When the doors of the Corn and Cotton Palace opened, out came the band. And some of those men had played in the band during the war. They knew how to play and they knew how to march, and they liked to do both. They were playing the national anthem. Behind them came the veterans, those that had worn the blue and those that had worn the gray, marching as one behind the Stars and Stripes. They were saying to Georgia and the nation and the world, as far as they were concerned, that old war was over and done with forever. And this was again the United States of America. Here it was, old wounds were healed, old barriers broken, as men who had met on the field of battle met again on the field of everyday living and taught this nation and the world an unforgettable lesson in forgiving and forgetting.
The parade came to be known as the Parade of Unity, and the Union and Confederate veterans who marched together in the parade formed Battalion 1 of the Blue and Gray. P.H. Fitzgerald had succeeded in establishing a colony of Northern Civil War veterans in the Deep South. He had seen the town take its first steps, and now the former Union Army drummer saw Confederate and Union veterans marching side by side as brothers. On December 2, 1896, the colony was formally incorporated as Fitzgerald, and the colony company ceased to exist as a governing entity. A century later, Beth Davis, the city's official historian, helped reenact a pivotal event in the history of the town.
For the 100th birthday of the town, I called the roll, and the same place where the original roll call was called. And I had an answer from Maine to Hawaii and from Alaska to Florida.
To this day, Fitzgerald calls the roll of states on special occasions. The answers still come from every corner of the United States of America, and the lessons of those early settlers are etched into the town's identity forever.
If the men who settled this town, all those Yanks who came here and all the Confederate veterans from the area, if they could work together and forget the differences, surely we can today. And we do.